March 1922. Rural Bavaria, Germany. A farm sits alone in an open field. 6 people live there. A grandfather, his widowed daughter, her 2 children, a young farmhand, and a maid who had only just started work days before. On a morning in late March, neighbors notice something wrong. The farm is quiet, too quiet. Smoke has been rising from the chimney for days. Someone is clearly home, keeping a fire going, but nobody has been seen coming or going. The children haven't shown up for school. The farmer hasn't been to town. A group of neighbors walk over to check. They find all 6 of them dead, murdered, hidden in the barn under a layer of straw and inside the house. But here is the detail that changes everything. When investigators arrive and study the snow around the farmhouse, they find footprints. A single set of footprints leading toward the farm from the forest. No footprints leading away. Whoever came to that farm stayed there for days, living among the bodies, feeding the cattle, keeping the fire burning, sleeping under the same roof as 6 dead people. Over 100 years later, this case has never been solved. And the question of who stayed in that farmhouse and why is one of the most disturbing unanswered questions in the history of crime. This is Hinterkaifeck.
If you're new here, this channel covers real mysteries, the ones that don't get clean endings, the ones that stay with you. And Hinterkaifeck? This is one of those cases that people who study true crime come back to over and over. Because it's not just a murder mystery, it's something stranger than that, something that feels almost impossible. And the more you dig into it, the more questions you have. Here's what we're going to cover. We're going to meet the Gruber family, who they were, where they lived, and the eerie things that happened in the weeks before the murders that nobody took seriously enough. Then we're going to walk through the crime scene in detail, including exactly what the evidence tells us about the timeline. Then we're going to go through the theories, and there are several genuinely credible ones, and talk about why, even after a century of investigation, nobody has ever been charged. Before we start, a content note. This case involves the murder of children, including a young girl. I'll cover it seriously and respectfully, but I wanted you to know up front. Let's go.
Hinterkaifeck. The name itself sounds remote, and it was. It was a small farmstead, not even a town, just a cluster of buildings located between the Bavarian villages of Weidhofen and Schrobenhausen, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. In 1922, it sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by flat farmland and forest. The nearest neighbors were not close. The farm was owned by Andreas Gruber, 63 years old. Andreas was a farmer, hardworking, stubborn, a man who had spent his entire life working this land. By all accounts, he was not a warm man. Neighbors described him as difficult, secretive, prone to conflict. He had a reputation in the local community that was, to put it carefully, complicated. Living with him was his wife, Cäzilia Gruber, 72 years old. Their widowed daughter, Viktoria Gabriel, 35, had moved back to the farm after her husband died in World War I. Victoria had 2 children with her, Cäzilia, who was 7 years old, and Josef, who was just 2 years old. And here is where things get uncomfortable even before the murders. Josef Gabriel, Victoria's young son, was, according to widespread local gossip and later police suspicion, the child of Andreas Gruber, Victoria's own father. Andreas had been investigated for incest years before, and the community knew it. This detail matters, and we'll come back to it when we get to the theories. The sixth person on the farm was a young farmhand named Andreas Baumgartner, 22 years old. And then, just 4 days before the murders, a new maid arrived at the farm. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44. She had taken the job knowing almost nothing about the family she was going to work for. 4 days. She had been there for 4 days when she was killed. Now, here is something crucial you need to understand about the weeks leading up to March 1922, because the Hinterkaifeck murders did not come out of nowhere. There were warnings, strange occurrences that Andreas Gruber himself reported, and that he, for reasons nobody has ever understood, chose to ignore. Sometime in the weeks before the murders, Andreas told a neighbor and the local locksmith that he had found strange footprints in the snow leading from the forest to his farmhouse. The footprints went to the farm, they did not go back. He also reported that he had discovered in the space between the farmhouse and the barn a narrow connecting structure called the stodel, a newspaper that nobody on the farm had ordered, a newspaper that didn't belong there. And he reported that he had heard footsteps in the attic at night. And he told the neighbors. He told the locksmith. He even mentioned it at some point to the local priest. Multiple people knew something was wrong at the Gruber farm, and nobody did anything. Nobody called the police. Nobody went out to check. And Andreas Gruber, this stubborn, difficult man who had survived a world war and built a life in the middle of nowhere, decided to handle it himself. What he did or didn't do to handle it, we don't know, because a few weeks later, everyone on the farm was dead.
Let's talk about what investigators found when they arrived at Hinterkaifeck in late March 1922. The bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cäzilia, his daughter Viktoria, and 7-year-old Cäzilia Gabriel were found in the stodel, the barn structure connecting the farmhouse to the outer buildings. They were hidden under straw. All 4 had been struck with a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe, with extreme force. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The farmhand, Andreas Baumgartner, was found dead in his quarters. 2-year-old Josef Gabriel and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, were found dead inside the farmhouse itself. Josef in his crib, Maria in her room. 6 people, all killed with the same type of blunt instrument. The murder weapon, believed to be the family's own mattock, was never definitively recovered, though a mattock with possible blood residue was found on the property. Now let's talk about the timeline, because this is where things go from tragic to deeply, deeply strange. Based on physical evidence, the state of the bodies, the condition of the farm, and witness accounts from neighbors, investigators determined that the murders had taken place on the evening of Friday, March 31st, or in the very early hours of Saturday, April 1st, 1922. The bodies were not discovered until Tuesday, April 4th. That means for approximately 3 to 4 days, possibly longer, the farm appeared to be occupied and functioning. The cattle had been fed, recently and regularly. Fresh food had been consumed from the kitchen. The fire in the hearth had been kept burning. Neighbors who passed the farm in those days reported seeing smoke from the chimney. One neighbor reported seeing a figure in the yard. The farm looked lived in. Someone was there. Someone was maintaining the farm, feeding the animals, keeping warm by the fire, after killing 6 people and hiding their bodies in the barn. Think about that. Sit with that for a second. The killer or killers were not in a panic. They were not fleeing. They stayed, they ate, they slept. For multiple days, they lived on that farm with the bodies of the people they had killed. And then, at some point, they left. And because snow had fallen or conditions had changed, no clean trail of footprints leading away from the farm was ever found. The only confirmed footprints in the snow were the ones leading to the farm, from the forest. Now here is another detail that has fascinated investigators for a century. 7-year-old Cäzilia Gabriel, the oldest of the 2 children, was found in the barn with the adults, but forensic examination suggested she had not died immediately. She had pulled out clumps of her own hair. She had been alive for some time after the initial attack, alone, in the dark, in the barn, with the bodies of her family around her. She was 7 years old.
The investigation found no evidence of robbery. Valuables and cash on the farm were undisturbed. No evidence of sexual assault. No clear motive. No obvious suspect. The family's mail had been collected and placed neatly on the kitchen table, suggesting the killer had been intercepting post to prevent anyone from noticing the family's silence.
Now, before I keep going, I actually want to know what you think. The killer stayed at that farm for days. They fed the cattle, kept the fire burning, and collected the family's mail. That last detail, collecting the mail, suggests they were deliberately managing how the outside world perceived the farm. What do you think was going through that person's mind during those days? Were they planning to stay longer? Were they waiting for something specific? Or does that behavior point to a particular type of person? Someone with a very specific reason to be there? Drop your theory in the comments right now. I read every single one. Seriously, some of you guys come up with things that even I hadn't considered. I'll be replying down there. Okay, back to the story. The initial investigation was, to be honest, badly handled. Local police and investigators arrived at the scene, but the farmhouse was not properly sealed. Curious neighbors and locals wandered through the crime scene. Evidence was disturbed. The bodies were eventually exhumed and the skulls sent to Munich for forensic analysis. And then, in one of the most infuriating footnotes in this entire case, the skulls were lost. During World War II, they disappeared from the Munich records, the physical evidence from one of Germany's most famous unsolved murders, gone. Over the decades that followed, investigators and researchers identified over 100 suspects. Let me walk you through the 3 most credible theories. Theory 1 involves a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a neighbor and had a complicated history with the Gruber family. Specifically, he had previously been in a relationship with Viktoria Gabriel, Andreas's daughter. He may have been the father of Josef, the 2-year-old. He had paid money to the Gruber family in connection with Josef. When the bodies were discovered, it was Schlittenbauer who organized the group of neighbors that found them. It was Schlittenbauer who was first into the barn and seemed to know exactly where to look for the bodies. Investigators noted that he did not lift the straw to check under it. He moved it aside in a specific, deliberate way that suggested he already knew what was there. He also, in the chaos of that first day, may have removed or disturbed certain evidence. When questioned, his statements were inconsistent. The motive theory. Schlittenbauer may have wanted to eliminate the Gruber family to erase evidence of the incest accusations, to avoid ongoing financial demands, or for reasons connected to the paternity of young Josef. He knew the farm. He knew the family. He had a reason to want silence. Theory 2 points to someone within the family's own circle. Possibly a person connected to the dark secret of the Gruber family's incestuous relationships. Andreas Gruber had enemies in the local community. His reputation was damaged. There were people who held grudges. And the intimate nature of the killings, the fact that the murderer was comfortable enough to stay for days, suggests someone who knew this farm well, who felt, on some level, that they belonged there. Theory 3 is the one that gets the least attention but deserves consideration. That the killer was a drifter or vagrant who had been living in or near the Hinterkaifeck property for some time before the murders. Remember, Andreas Gruber reported hearing footsteps in the attic weeks before the killings. He reported finding a stranger's newspaper. He reported seeing footprints leading to the farm that he could not explain. What if someone had already moved in? What if someone had been living in the attic or in the stottle, watching the family, learning their routines for weeks? When Andreas Gruber finally discovered evidence of this intruder, confronted them or got too close to finding them, that person struck first. The sustained presence after the murders fits this theory particularly well. If someone had been living secretly on this farm before the killings, they were already accustomed to being there. The farm was, in a strange sense, already their home.
The case was officially reinvestigated by the Munich police in 2007. After a thorough review of all available documents, they concluded that Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the most credible suspect, but that the evidence was insufficient to have ever resulted in a prosecution. He died in 1941, taking whatever he knew to his grave. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain officially unsolved.
Here's what I keep coming back to with this case. The footprints. Andreas Gruber saw those footprints in the snow. He told people about them. He knew something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong on his property, and he chose to stay. He chose not to call for help. He chose to face whatever was in that attic, in that barn, in those shadows, alone. Was it pride? Stubbornness? An old farmer's refusal to show fear? Or did he think he knew who it was and believed he could handle it himself? We don't know. We'll never know. Because whatever Andreas Gruber suspected, he never wrote it down, never told anyone definitively, and never had the chance to act on it. 6 people died at Hinterkaifeck in March 1922. Andreas and Cäzilia Gruber, Viktoria Gabriel, little Cäzilia, who was 7, baby Josef, who was 2, and Maria Baumgartner, who had been there for 4 days and had done nothing to deserve any of it. The person who killed them, whoever they were, managed to disappear so completely that over a century of investigation, over 100 suspects, multiple re-investigations, and the attention of criminologists and true crime researchers worldwide has not produced a definitive answer. Somewhere in the Bavarian countryside, there is a farmstead where 6 people were buried. The farm itself was eventually demolished. The land is just land now. But the question of who walked out of that forest and into that farm, and who came back out, and when, and why, that question is still there. And honestly, I don't think it's ever going away.
Andreas Gruber heard footsteps in his attic for weeks. He knew something was wrong, and instead of asking for help, he kept it to himself and hoped it would resolve itself. I think about that a lot. The things we ignore, the warnings we rationalize away, the sounds we tell ourselves aren't what we think they are. If this case got under your skin the way it's gotten under mine, there's a subscribe button somewhere on your screen. The people who stay around here are the ones who can't leave a question unanswered. They're the ones who hear a sound in the attic and have to know what it is. And if something in this story surprised you, that thumbs up is how you tell me. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. It tells the algorithm that this kind of careful, serious storytelling is worth showing to people. Also, there's someone in your life who loves unsolved historical mysteries, the kind of person who reads about cold cases at 2 a.m. You know exactly who it is. Send this to them. They'll be awake tonight anyway. I'll see you in the next one. Check your attic.